as you can see, the overall score distribution on the midterm was really good. Most people, on the average, got in the solid B range, which is excellent. So again, I'm going to go through, and if there's a question that just about everybody got right, I'm not going to talk about it, but if there are questions that are a little bit more challenging, I want to break those down. Remember that the midterm is 200 points, or 20% of your overall grade. So if you're feeling like you didn't do a great job on the midterm and you see your grade taking a hit, remember that the easiest ways to offset that include doing well on these upcoming essays, as well as continuing to work on things like the extra credit opportunity and making up attendance for days that you might have missed. So half of this, 100 points, was your multiple choice. Each of these questions was worth 4 points. The highest score on the midterm exam was 196 out of 200. So everybody had a total of 4 points added on to their score. So that set the curve, and everybody benefited from that. Some of these early questions were related to different models of communication. So this idea here, Kurt pats Bobby on the shoulder. This relates to different types of nonverbal communication. The best answer here is the use of haptics. Remember that haptics involves touch, so tapping somebody on the shoulder. Kinesics would involve more of the things such as movement, like gestures, and so on. So if Bobby was waving, that would fit under kinesics. The use of physical touch best fits under haptics. Vocalics would be involved the use of voice to communicate, so it's not the best answer for this question. So nonverbal communication, right, can contradict or go against the thing that you're saying. So maybe you're saying something in a sarcastic tone. That's contradicting. Accenting, right, is an element where you're saying, I need to go to the store. You're highlighting an individual sentence. So enforcing is not one of these elements in that grid of 6 that we talked through about nonverbal communication. Uncertainty reduction theory suggests that we experience both cognitive and behavioral uncertainty. Cognitive is sort of in our heads and it's our minds, it's how we're imagining or thinking about an issue. Behavioral uncertainty is questions about the action that we would be taking to address the issue. So social and cultural might be contexts or situations in which it comes up, but those would not be the major categories. So intra and interpersonal don't fit here because interpersonal communication is communication with yourself. So that wouldn't make sense for reducing uncertainty with other people. Attribution error, right, is our tendency to look at somebody such as they're having a bad day, they're in a bad mood, and to think they don't like me or they're a bad person. Where we attribute somebody's mood or emotions or situation into a broader generalization about who they are and how they feel about us. So if Blake seems angry, frustrated, and we think, oh, they must hate me, that would be attribution error. Taxonomy of listening involves things such as critical listening, appreciative listening, and so on, so it wouldn't be appropriate here. Connotative meaning refers to the social and cultural definition of a word, so that wouldn't be a good fit here either. This question here is a little bit trickier. So this is about the ladder of abstraction. You might recall a model that we used in the course where we looked at a physical ladder. We said something general, like the word thing, to something specific, a blue desk chair. So levels of abstraction range from that level of broadness to specificity. Meta-messaging would be communication about communication. So that wouldn't be a good fit here. Syntactic rules are ways that we might be using words in a sentence, so the use of commas. So that wouldn't be the best answer here either. So abstraction would best describe the range of the word choices that we employ. So a strong desire to engage in other cultures would be best fit under motivational. So cultural intelligence was one of the things we went over shortly before the exam. Behavioral approach is more about the direct action that you would take in order to acclimate to a culture, such as learning a language. Motivational ties here to the desire or wish to engage with other cultures. So you are motivated and you have a desire to engage in cultures, makes motivational the best response. Cognitive is your knowledge of another culture. Metacognitive is thinking about and applying your knowledge to intercultural communication. Dre's knowledge about other cultures is cognitive, right? So the difference here is that Dre's knowledge itself, right, having knowledge about cultures, would fit under cognitive. The difference here is that metacognitive is more about how you're using or applying your knowledge to engage with a culture. So in a metacognitive approach, Dre might be thinking, given the knowledge that he has, he's going to wait for the oldest person to eat first because that's customary for that culture. So metacognitive and cognitive are a key difference here. And cognitive is knowledge, while metacognitive is how that knowledge is being used and applied. Bonnie, right? Bonnie's attachment style is dismissing. Remember that dismissing attachment is feeling good about yourself, having a good sense of self-identity, but not having a good sense of the identity of other people. Fearful is when you don't feel good about yourself or about others. Secure is when you're feeling good about yourself and others. Preoccupied is when you have a lot of interest in other people, but not a lot of self-esteem. You're very concerned about whether or not somebody likes you. So if you're really anxious about somebody texting you, you care a lot about that other person, but you're worried that they don't feel the same. Text sent to 5 people is not interpersonal communication because interpersonal communication is primarily dyadic, right? It is between a dyad or 2 people. So communication is mainly between 2 people. There's some work that gets into maybe 3 or 4, but a text sent to 5 people would not fit under the definition of interpersonal communication. Zoom meeting with a close friend is, because it's one-on-one, it's meaningful, and it can be through the use of media. Tone of voice is nonverbal communication. So the words themselves, whether they're spoken or written, are interpersonal communication. The way that those words are said or conveyed through things such as tone, pitch, things like vocalics, and so on, do fit under nonverbal communication. So the verbal element can be challenging here. Verbal is about how the words themselves are. Nonverbal is how those words are conveyed. Again, I use the example of like delivering pizza. Are you ordering it on an app? Are you picking up in a store? How something is delivered is going to change through nonverbal communication. Norms are not hard-coded. They're instead rules that you might be following informally. Taxonomy of listening does include critical listening at the top. Remember that taxonomy of listening could include things such as critical listening and appreciative listening, and towards the bottom includes things such as comprehension. Again, that just goes to a model that we talked about. So let's talk about the short essay questions. Each of these short essay questions was worth 33 points, plus I added a bonus point. So this one asked you to pick 2 of the 3 readings outside of the Wrench textbook. This was the least popular choice, but again, I give you the option to choose what strategically, based on your own knowledge and expertise, you feel the most comfortable answering. So, key ideas and concepts. I had people who were contrasting, in particular, the Nasarima and Internet Friends readings. The Nasarima reading, of course, looking at culture and the ways that portraying America as very strange and weird from an outsider is interesting, but also the challenges that things such as Zoom meetings have posed for our ability to pick up on nonverbal cues. So I think people did a good job of articulating key ideas. Both are related. This Internet Friends piece is about how we form and get rid of our interpersonal relationships over time using media. Nasarima is about how we engage with culture and identity. There's also the reading about why virtual meetings are so weird. It was talking about how our inability to pick up on nonverbal cues easily can add challenges in understanding a message. So the idea that nonverbal communication plays a really big role is important here. They differ because Nasarima is focused on culture, Internet Friends is focused on creating and maintaining relationships, and the Zoom meeting is more about how we pick up on nonverbal cues. Most people who tackled this question did a great job. Just wanted to go over what made for a good one. Culture, right? So culture was defined pretty well here by a lot of folks. Remember that culture, sort of the rules that we play by, it's a lot of different elements that make us who we are, including our membership in groups, elements of identity, such as nationality and ethnicity, and so on. Culture is very much inherited and passed down over time. Collective self-esteem, so this is where the question got a little bit trickier for some people. Collective self-esteem is how you perceive yourself and your relationship to that group, right? So collective self-esteem includes things such as, do you value the group itself? Do you think the group is good or bad? Do you see yourself as a good or bad member of the group? How closely do you tie the group to your identity? So collective self-esteem was a specific concept that we brought up in the class. So a good response here is one that engages with the elements of collective self-esteem and applies them here. 6 spectrums of culture. So there was some variation here. Face work is not a spectrum of culture. 6 spectrums of culture include things such as individualism to collectivism, masculine to feminine, high context to low context, low time orientation to high time orientation, and so on, right? A spectrum covers a sort of set of extremes. So collective self-esteem, if you tied it together to one of these spectrums, was overall a really good response. So again, pretty good responses here, but there was some trickiness in some of the specifics. This question, intrapersonal communication and identity. So please make sure that you're reading these questions carefully. I tried to make sure that this was especially clear because intrapersonal communication is mentioned about 5 times. So please make sure to reread and double check your prompts in the future. Some people wrote about interpersonal communication, which was not the question. So intrapersonal communication, again, is communication with yourself. It could be everything such as an internal dialogue to talking to yourself in the mirror on the road. So we talked through interpersonal communication as a way that we choose to maybe clear our throats, to share a little bit about ourselves, to feel more comfortable. Some of the needs that can fulfill is about helping us to prepare for and engage with issues of the day, helping us to kind of psych ourselves up. People had some really good examples and applications here about how to use interpersonal communication to organize their thoughts. Maybe you have a big game coming up and so on. So there was some good application here of this. But if you did not address intrapersonal communication specifically, this was a slightly more challenging question. The transactional model of communication. So there's a bit of variation here. So one thing that I noticed was that there were some responses that didn't really use the transactional model. So if there were responses that were talking about things such as context, that's not really a major part of this model. Remember that the transactional model was one of the first ideas we brought up in the class. It involves a sender, a receiver, feedback, which would be things like the nonverbal cues that we use in response to a message, like nodding, and also things such as noise, which gets in the way of effective communication. It can be physical noise, like something going on in the background, or it could be things like psychological and physiological, if you're feeling distracted, having a rough day, and so on. So there were some questions that didn't engage in all of the parts of the transactional model. So if there were some missing parts here, that was an issue. But people who identified the major parts, I think did so pretty well. An example of communication between 2 people. So it's really looking for, okay, here's the sender, here's the receiver, here's the feedback, here's the noise, and so on. So if you applied them pretty specifically, you were in good shape. One major thing that people talked about here in ambiguity or unclear messages, right, was the idea that we oftentimes experience this as a result of noise or issues with decoding, right, or receiving messages. So that's a really good way to describe some of the challenges here. The transactional model helps us to understand how communication breakdowns happen if we're not fully understanding each other's messages and so on. So again, I think people overall did a really solid job on the exam. If there's other specific questions that you might have on some of these, I'm happy to work through that. Does anybody have any questions about exam grades, how the midterm was graded, or anything else related to the midterm? If you're looking through your own score and you say to yourself, I don't know why I got this wrong, or I'd like some help, and I want to better understand why I got the score that I did, please reach out to me, and I'm happy to support you. So, I think the discussion group did a great job today of talking through some of the key theories in media and identity. So, rather than go over each of those in super big detail, I want to provide some additional examples in context that I think helps us to understand why some of these theories are significant and matter for the study of interpersonal communication. So UNG, or uses and gratifications theory, right, is an approach that essentially suggests that we have a really big role to play in media that we choose. So if you think about it, in the past, when newspapers, print journalism at the turn of the century was really becoming a thing, right? In the past, we tended to see media as having a major level of control on our identities and how we thought about issues. So a lot of areas in mass media, right, and media framing suggest that there's both issue selection, what are the things that the news chooses to talk about, and how is it framed, like a picture frame, what's in or what's out of the frame. So a news headline that suggests, for instance, the United States goes on the offense on the war on terror, presents the United States in favorable light, in an offensive or forward-thinking light, and so on. So how that topic is chosen and how that topic is presented, of course, matters a lot. So in the past, there was a big emphasis on the idea that media, including print journalism, tells us how to think, and that we're essentially passive. We take in information. UNG, uses and gratification, is the opposite. It suggests that instead, humans are the ones in control. That is, media is responding to us, to our interests, to our needs, to our concerns, and so on, right? One way of thinking about this is to think about the grocery store. So if you are going to the grocery store, right, looking through the produce section, you're trying to pick out, what types of vegetables to get, what are the things that you want to make the recipes, or the other things that are interesting to you, right? So in this way, we are picking out media on the basis of what our interests are and the things that we would like to have fulfilled, right? When we talk about things like media polarization, the idea that many folks will oftentimes choose media that tends to align with their social or political views, right? That ties into uses and gratifications, that we are seeking out media that reinforces our own ideas. So UNG is an idea that we use media actively and we select media based on the needs that we have ourselves. It's not that media creates needs, it's that we have needs and media responds to those needs accordingly. One example here is that a lot of major publications, such as Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Guardian, and so on, right, have tended to switch to a subscription model where you're limited in the number of articles that you can access. And many of these publications have switched to this model because they've had lower readership, lower subscriptions, and so they've upped the prices accordingly. Meanwhile, the use of a lot more kind of pop culture things, such as using social media to access the news, or things such as listicles from things like BuzzFeed have gotten a lot more popular, right? To respond to the changing circumstances and interests that we have. So, right, if a movie, so we've seen a ton of superhero movies over the last several years, some good, some bad, and that UNG would suggest that because of our interest in the genre, that we've seen those movies come out as a result. Social presence theory, right, essentially is an argument that the physical presence, as the discussion leading group brought up, is a major part of how we communicate, understand, and get to know one another. In other words, right, as the Why Are Zoom Meetings So Weird article brought up, one of the major challenges that we have when we have like this massive, massive Zoom room, like you might have had in a class before, or class currently, is that because we're looking at these tiny, tiny boxes, there's so much nonverbal information that's missing. Things like somebody's entire body and physicality, their use of proximity, their use of touch, the intricacies of their facial expressions. If you have a professor who's continuing to talk while muted and is not responding to the chat, to respond to the message that they are muted and need help, right? There's a lot of things that might be missing that we get face-to-face. So social presence theory suggests that in a face-to-face encounter, there is so much that we're able to get from that relationship. Remember, up to 93% of our communication can be nonverbal. That our decision to use mediated forms of communication has significant gaps and issues. So, you know, an example of this is Snapchat. Because Snapchat, unless you are screen capturing, right, will generally limit the amount of time you could even see an image. So, by comparison, social presence physically might provide you with more opportunities. Media richness theory. How many people have ever used or tried like a noise canceling device, like a noise canceling pair of headphones? Yeah, so a few of you, right? These have become much more popular in recent years, particularly for folks that might have unique disability or access needs, right? For instance, folks on the autism spectrum, right, encounter challenges with things like sensory overstimulation. Putting on noise-canceling headphones is a great way to reduce that sensory overstimulation and keep people focused. I use noise-canceling headphones all the time. It's a great way for me to focus and pay attention on things like grading. So media richness theory suggests that, in other words, media has an immense amount of power precisely because of the limited information that it provides, right? So in contrast to something like social presence theory, media richness theory says no. Media can actually have a really big role. I like the way the discussion group brought up the different spectrum of how rich media can be, right? It can be either just something like a text that's not very engaged, or something that's super engaged or dynamic, such as VR. So media richness theory, if you have your noise canceling headphones on, if you're like listening to music or watching a video, you're tuning out everything else, you're like directly focused on the song. If you're like me, sometimes it's just really nice to like zone out, close your eyes, and listen to a song. So media richness theory suggests that the degree to which media can be limited can actually make that media more powerful and more engaging. Kind of similar to this idea is social information processing theory. How many of you have ever played like a MMO or a game that has like a large online presence or online world? So, maybe a couple of you, right? So World of Warcraft is an example. A lot of other games, such as like League of Legends, Overwatch, and so on, still have some level of this type of identification. But social information processing theory suggests that we can engage in what's called hyper-personal communication. That by using media, we can have this really close and really engaged relationship with somebody else. One example of this in media, has anybody seen the film that came out a few years ago with Joaquin Phoenix called Her? Anybody heard of or seen that movie? So the movie basically depicts a character who is like forming this romantic relationship with an artificial intelligence that is only a voice, right? But the voice is evolving and growing, and he's directly speaking to her. So it's an example of social information processing theory and hyper-personal communication. You have this deep, meaningful connection with like artificial intelligence because you're able to directly speak to and engage with that population. So social information processing theory suggests that through things such as these large role-playing games or other things like that, we're able to develop these really interesting and close relationships that go beyond what we can offer face-to-face. So, for instance, if you've played like a game where you and your online friends are doing like a raid, or you're doing a mission together over the weekend, you have a unique opportunity to bond and learn from each other that you wouldn't necessarily get face-to-face, right? So we'll go over some of these other elements of presenting oneself a bit more on Friday, and I think the discussion leading group did a great job too. So as a reminder, prepare and continue to prepare for your essay. Remember that next Wednesday is the last day that I can look at your outline or rough draft for feedback. Let me know if you have further questions on the midterm or as you're working through it. You've got issues with presenting that effectively. And remember that mediated communication is deeply tied to identity and expression. No new readings for Friday. We'll continue to talk about your essay and some elements of mediated communication. Go ahead and pass forward your prompts for today, and I will see you